elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, welcome once again to Society and the State. Brian Hyde along with Connor Boyack. So do you have a line in the sand? I'm going to start by asking you, Connor. Is there a line in the sand that people should not cross?
Ooh.
Lest they risk Connor standing up?
Oh, for me personally.
Yeah.
So it's, for me, it used to be, this is kind of a silly one and not what you're thinking, but I was very late in hitting puberty. And so I was very short, like very, very short. And I was picked on a lot. I was bullied quite a bit in high school because of that. And so I had kind of developed this line in the sand where even once kind of puberty hit and I was starting to grow or whatever, my line in the sand was do not comment about my height. That would set me off. That would provoke ire that you could not imagine, just because it was such a sore spot that I wanted to kind of protect, that injured part of me or whatever. But yeah, it did kind of create this demarcation, this line where, there was no room for people to kind of step over, wait in a little bit. Like there was immediate reaction whenever that happened.
Did you ever go to a bagel shop?
I used to work.
Asking for. I used to
work at a bagel shop.
Have you seen the video of the guy in the bagel shop? He's a short guy.
No.
And apparently he has been on the receiving end of bullying and discrimination.
Okay.
Apparently at the hands of a number of women who didn't like it because of his height. And this guy goes off. And I mean, he has an absolute come apart. He's throwing things. He's cursing. He's just absolutely denouncing. It's a very misogynistic kind of rant. But it all went back to his height. So I'm kind of halfway joking, but it's a viral video that...
I'll have to go look that up.
Yeah, I think Barry Brownstein, writing for the Foundation for Economic Education, said, he could learn a thing or two from the Stoics. But you just accept the hand that life has dealt you and you move forward from it.
I'll tell you what another one would be, though, is if my neighbor started doing things to my yard, started coming across my property line. If he took up the fence and moved it 4 feet into my... onto my property line, I would take issue with that. I would definitely resist that. If he started like planting things he liked on my side of the fence, right? Or if he started like hosting parties and his guests were leaving their litter all over my lawn, I think a property line is a good example. That's kind of a literal line in the sand, right?
Okay. No, that's an excellent example. Now, I'm going to throw a little more ideological one out there, but I think this one may be a hot button for some people. How about for your kids? For instance, the local library says, hey, we're going to have drag queen story hour. Aren't you going to bring your kids on down for it?
Yikes.
Okay. Now, I'm not telling everybody that's something you ought to be mad about, but can you understand how some parents would say, I like to go to the library and turn my kids loose because I know it's a place where they can go and learn and they can grow. But if that's one of the events that's taking place there, there are parents who say, that's my line in the sand. My kids don't get to go to the library and just roam anymore.
Yeah. This is an interesting question, though. So when we determine what our own personal lines in the sand are, it almost feels like you have to preemptively decide that rather than deciding in the moment, right? Because if it's this reactionary thing where something happens, I think it's going to be easier to write it off as, oh, it's just this one time. Oh, I'm already here. Let's just do it. Or, oh, we've already spent the money. Let's watch the full movie, even though I'm feeling very conflicted about it, right? And this kind of bleeds into some like spiritual type of issues as well, certainly where we see the same patterns. But it almost feels like we're being tempted by the state or statism or bad policies or ideas or whatever. And you need to preemptively decide that when tempted with those things or when presented with those things, especially when it comes to your children and their formative years and stuff, that you need to have already decided, like, you know what? In these types of situations, we're just going to not expose our kids to this, or we're not going to participate, something like that.
No, I think you're dead on with that. You're right. You have to make it up. You have to make your mind up before you're in the situation. Otherwise, it's a lot easier to just kind of go with the flow.
When the Pledge of Allegiance is said, I'll remain seated.
and here's another one. Okay, and this is probably one of the uglier examples. So Antifa is out there demonstrating in the streets of Portland. Here come the Proud Boys, ready to literally crack heads because they've got a line in the sand. This is our city, and we're going to fight them. There's an example of people who say, well, I'm not going to put up with people saying that they own our streets when I own the streets. The bigger question that I'm asking behind that line in the sand, though, is not only, how do you go about drawing that line? but what's an appropriate way to make a line in the sand and then stand, for what you believe in without becoming, some street brawler in the process?
Well, and the flip side of this is actually following through on what you said. Maybe not the best example, but one comes to mind is the Free State Project. This was a group of libertarians who were like, hey, we're all going to decide on one state to move into, and when we reach sufficient number of pledges of people who would move for this project, then you have a limited time. I think it was 5 years where you all have to move. It was much easier to commit years ago when that was it, but life changes, things happen. And so now when that is triggered and it's like, hey, everyone move to New Hampshire, it's a bit harder to follow through on what that initial commitment was. I feel like drawing a line in the sand is easier to say, right? Easier said than done, right? It's easier to say, oh, if this ever happened, if the government ever tried to take away people's guns, right?
Good example.
If the government removed the vaccination exemptions for personal choice and religious choice, then I would homeschool so my kids wouldn't be in public. It's easy to say these things ahead of time. It's much harder when you're confronted with the need for action to actually follow through on those words, because those words are inherently confrontational. You're saying that if in this game of chicken, the state does X, then I will do Y. And if this event happens, I will respond this way. It's easy to talk about that in theory, right? It's harder, I think, when it actually comes time to commit and to act, to actually follow through on what you had previously decided you would do. But now when you see that, your life is on the line, your reputation is on the line, it's controversial, you're going to lose friends over it, you lose a job over it, I think it's unfortunately harder.
And I'm going to give you an example of something that I'm having to deal with right now. I have long hated the Real ID policy on the federal government, which turns your driver's license into a de facto national ID. I don't think that our identity should be a state-granted privilege. I think that that can lead to abuse. However, my ticket's already bought to go visit my daughter and her husband in Germany at Christmas. My driver's license does not have the little star designation. Yeah. And according to the regulations, by October, if I don't have that, I may not get to go. Now, there might be a workaround. Maybe with my passport, I could make it happen. But the bottom line is that was a line in the sand for me. And now I have to consider, okay, do I need to redraw that line? I don't think I can function without a driver's license, or at least, until I get pulled over. And then it's going to be really hard to function sitting in handcuffs.
Exactly. That's right. I remember when the TSA really started, I did a protest with some folks up at the Salt Lake Airport. We were handing out literature. We were really raising these kind of Fourth Amendment issues and invasive searches. And one of the Miss America folks had just been groped and her video went viral. And there was kind of heightened awareness of opposition to TSA. And at the time it was, I'm not going to fly anymore. I'm just going to drive wherever I need to go. We're going to go on a vacation. I'm just going to drive. This is ridiculous. I am not going to surrender, my Fourth Amendment. And I'll be very frank. This illustrates the problem I think we all have. I was very resistant to flying if doing so meant surrendering my Fourth Amendment rights, letting them search through my luggage, letting them grope me. And I was very adamant. Well, of course, life goes on. That kind of brazenness softens a little bit. You don't have the same animation that you once did. And then necessity sets in. In your case, going to foreign travel. In my case, business. I as Libertas started taking off, I couldn't drive to the East Coast and go to all these meetings in D.C., and my work necessitated it. So it became okay, well, I guess I have to. And so now that previous boycott was set aside. But now it was every time I go to the airport, I will refuse to go through the nudie scanners. I will not go through the machine. I'm going to force this individual to awkwardly pat me down so that they cannot passively violate the Fourth Amendment. I want him to have to make contact and feel awkward. Maybe I'll make an awkward groan or two as they're conducting their pat down, right? But no, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to. Well, okay, so I did that for years. In fact, as you may remember from traveling with us at Libertas and other staff, it was kind of a running thing that everyone would kind of go through, and Connor would get a pat down every single time. You always got it. Yep. Yeah. And okay, well, so then things get busier and busier and busier, and I've got to make flights, and I'm running late, and oh man, I don't want to sit here for half an hour again. And so now I've changed that. I no longer stand by that anymore. I first of all, I did TSA pre-check, which is amazing, but it's what's the word? It's they're holding me hostage. They're extorting me for my own freedoms, right? Oh, you can keep your shoes on if you pay us a little bit of money. Like, it's ridiculous, but so amazing that we can experience a modicum of freedom, the pre 9/11 freedom of, like, this is what it might have been like a little more to go through the airport. But now more often as I'm doing TSA pre-check, I'm going through a metal detector, which I'm fine with, rather than the nudie scanners. And I don't know. So life goes on, and it becomes harder to remain committed to that previous ideal, and necessity and time management and stuff urge me to abandon those previous long-held positions. So I think this kind of illustrates, at least for me, the tough thing with drawing a line in the sand and remaining committed to it.
Well, and I share this because I want people to know, either A, I'm a hypocrite, or B, sometimes my principles have to give way to pragmatism. And I think that every one of us faces that kind of decision. And so I have a choice to make. And believe me, I'm trying to find some way to work around it, but it really looks for all the world like I got to get a new driver's license, and it has to be Real ID compliant.
There's a quote from Thomas Jefferson I love where he says, "In matters of style, swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock." Right? There are certain cases where it's okay to go with the flow or whatever, but when it comes to principle, stand like a rock, line in the sand, right? It's super important. And maybe what we need to concede here, Brian, is that some things matter more than others. Like if you're going to have your rights so egregiously violated, maybe that comes to the point where you do resist. But I think the proverbial frog in the pot of boiling water is instructive, that much less frequent is the government that goes from 0 to 60 in terms of violating your rights. Much more common is when these things are very incremental in nature, and they're very slow, and they add a law here and they tweak a policy there, and okay, now it's not metal scanners. Oh, it's these detectors. Oh, but it's for your safety. Everything is just kind of incremental. There's a fantastic book analyzing why so many Jews went along with World War II with the Nazis, and it's called "And They Thought They Were Free." And you're familiar with it.
I was just going to mention it, so you're reading my mind here.
Excellent. Well,
yeah.
Please share your thoughts on it before I do.
This is one of the best books ever for illustrating how when everybody just kind of goes along or doesn't say something, when they don't have that line in the sand, you will reach a point where suddenly you realize, hey, things are not only a little bit wrong, but they're very wrong. But in their case, it was too dangerous to actually say anything about it because they hadn't drawn a line in the sand or spoken out earlier.
It's very instructive, I think, too, that this author was a journalist and a Jew, and he really wanted to kind of understand why, and he was of German descent, as I recall, but he wanted to understand and quantify why this was happening. How could so many people go along? And just like the frog and the boiling water, it's so interesting to read the commentary from the people he interviewed. Time and again, they would say, well, it was never any big thing. It was always just this tiny little thing, this adjustment, this excuse, this legitimate reason that made sense. And looking back on it, you can see how far you've come. Of course, I'm horribly paraphrasing. He says it so well in the book, this gentleman who's interviewed. He says, looking back through history, as you kind of compare where we came from to where we ended up, you see this profound distance that we had been kind of carried across with all this propaganda and indoctrination. But what you didn't sense at the time was how quickly things were moving, because it was always in context of one step, one step, one step. It was never in context of the distance overall that you were traveling. And so it was very hard for people, in the words of this gentleman, to see that you were moving so much. All the movements were just minor. People had a hard time realizing what they added up to.
He speaks about how they were all waiting, even the people, especially the people who realized something here's not right. But they were all confident there would come a moment where there would be this great shock and everybody would go, oh, yeah, of course, we can't do this.
Right.
But because it was incremental, like you were just describing, and that latest encroachment was just a little bit worse than the one before, and we didn't say anything before, you would appear to be a kind of a fanatic for speaking out.
I'm glad you brought that point up, because they do mention that in the book, that every time that you failed to object, solidified your inability to further object in the future. It created precedent.
Yep.
Well, why would we complain about this when we didn't complain about that last thing? You're exactly right for bringing that up, because they do in the book. And I think that plays into it for us as well. We didn't object to Real ID, enough perhaps. So why would we object to the fact that facial recognition is now being used on all our driver license photos around the country? Well, we didn't object to facial recognition, so why would we object to artificial intelligence being used? Well, we didn't object to that. Why would we object to Skynet? It's just for our protection, right? But it's such an instructive point. And maybe let's talk about this briefly, Brian. I think one of the hardest things too is imagine that you are one of our listeners is better than you and I. They are just this dogged, resistant line in the sand. If this ever happens, I will resist. More power to you. You're awesome. However, when it comes time to do so, you are surrounded by a society of people who are not doing the same, who have bought into the exceptions and the justifications and the arguments. Brian, what are your thoughts on how difficult it is for us to stand up, draw that line on the sand and stand based on where we drew that line, when everyone else around us is not only walking past that line, but turning and looking at us as they walk past the line with a bit of scorn, a bit of ridicule, a bit of you're crazy. How do we handle that?
I have a quote from St. Anthony the Great that I think addresses this. And maybe some people will relate to it. Maybe they see this kind of attitude today. He said, "A time is coming when men will go mad. And when they see someone who is not mad, they will attack him, saying, 'You are mad. You are not like us.'" Does that not sound like a situation you could conceivably find yourself in?
Totally.
So the key here is, do you know what you stand for? And then the question that follows hot on the heels of that one is, how willing are you to suffer for what you believe? And I'm not saying that just to be dramatic. Oh, I'm a victim. I'm suggesting that into the life of every man, woman, and child, there comes a point where we will stand at a crossroads individually and have to choose. Do I go along just because this is what everybody else is doing, or do I remain true to my beliefs, knowing very well that I could be called names or I could be ostracized, my business might suffer.
Mm-hmm.
I may have to actually part company with polite society because my beliefs forbid me from walking in lockstep with everybody else.
I think that's such an important point, and it's something that we would all do well, I think, to reflect on, especially the way society overall tends to go, the cyclical pattern of history being what it is. And, good conversation between family members, perhaps, to say what we will accept, what we will tolerate, what we won't, and be willing to commit to one another. It's very interesting to me, Brian, at the end of the Declaration of Independence, they mutually pledged to one another, their lives, their fortune, and their honor. It was kind of a team effort. They had gone through that experience together, and they said together that we're in this together. And I think that standing up for something is easier when there are other people. This is something that we all do better with when we're not the only ones standing out. And so it's a great thing, I think, for families to discuss is what is our family's line in the sand, whether this is kind of a spiritual, moral type of thing about what you want to resist culturally and things like that, or politically and ideologically and when it comes to our basic rights and freedoms. I think it's a really fun family discussion to have. And, maybe it's not to literally start saying, well, if the government ever does this, kids, grab the shotgun and let's go to the
pitchforks
bunker.
and torches.
Right. Yeah. But maybe it is willing to say, what would we be willing to do? And if things got so bad that these things started happening, how would we respond? I think it's a good conversation to have.
One final quote. I think this would be a good one to end on. This is from Gavin Nascimento. "In a world lost in the darkness of ignorance, deception, and confusion, a self-educated human being with morals is the light."
I like that.
So I'm not encouraging people, go find a place to contend and cause, contention and conflict. But if there's a place where you can be a light, that's probably where you can draw that line. And who knows, that kind of courage can be contagious, just like you were saying.
Exactly. If you stand up for something, it's going to be easier for other people to kind of join with you. So good opportunity for leadership and setting an example. And if nothing else, just a moment of reflection to ponder what your line in the sand would be. Guys, stick with us for the next episode. We're going to be talking about the importance of investing in yourself and some specific ideas for how to do that. Thanks for subscribing to Society and the State.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.